Tonight, I had promised to respond to some of your questions, and the way in which, and thank you for your questions, the way in which I've decided to tackle some of the questions is I've incorporated it into what I'm going to say in the beginning of this, and then we'll go into more general conversation, and there'll be time for more questions. I tried to put the questions in here, my responses to the questions in what I'm going to say, because so many of the questions that came through were along similar lines. And if this doesn't address your question, feel free to ask it when we get into the more general conversation. As always, I'm happy to be interrupted, but catch the attention of either Andrew or Mary Teresa, and they will interrupt me for you. For the sake of the recording, if you would mute yourselves, that would be helpful. So tonight I want to begin with the parable of the madman. And it goes a bit like this. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God." As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. "Have you lost him then?" said one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" said another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or immigrated?" Thus they shouted and laughed. The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. "Where has God gone?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers." But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as though an infinite is nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it become colder? Is it not more and more night coming on all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods do decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? With what water could we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we need to invent? Is it not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to be worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whosoever shall be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and again regarded his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground and broke it and went out. "I have come too early," he said to them. "My time has not come yet." The tremendous event is still on its way, still traveling. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time. Even after they are done, before they can be seen and heard, this deed is still more distant from them than the distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been further related that on the same day, the madman entered various churches and they sang a requiem. Let out and quietened, he is said to have retorted each time, "What are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Some of you will already recognize that this parable of the madman was written by Friedrich Nietzsche. One of the characteristics of a parable is that it surprises us with a truth that we already know. God is dead, and we have killed him. I think perhaps that Nietzsche's madman was right. God, the big guy up in the sky, judgmental, sanctified, wish-granting, personified, old bearded Superman Father God, is dead. And it is we, you and I, we who have killed him. This image of God has been sacrificed on the altars of reality. All that we have learned about the cosmos, all the scientific breakthroughs, our technologies, our philosophies, biblical scholarship, historical documentation, and our evolving theologies have killed the personification of God, which we once worshiped and adored. For most of my life, the personification of what we call God was the only way I had of knowing anything of the mystery which lies at the very heart of reality. I can truly empathize with the followers of Jesus who huddled together in that upper room. In my imagination, the parable of Jesus' death takes place in a ghostly, terrifying darkness. While it is so very tempting to lock the door against the unknowns lurking in the darkness, there is a line in the parable of Doubting Thomas which makes me wonder, not wonder in the sense of I wonder what this means, but wonder in the sense of, oh my God, as in how wonderful, how inspiring. The line in the parable which causes me to wonder will be on the lips of Jesus this coming Easter Sunday. Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Like the courageous Thomas in this parable, I suspect many of us continue to long for a vision of the divine mystery which we can see and touch. Say what you will about the big guy up in the sky, the judgmental, sanctified, wish-granting, personified, old bearded Superman Father God. This was an image we could certainly wrap our minds around. Peering into the darkness and the sheer vastness of the cosmos, it is impossible to wrap our minds around the one in whom the cosmos has being. Faced with the enormity of the one who is beyond the beyond and beyond that also, I can certainly understand why our ancestors insisted that no one can look upon the face of God and live. Shut the front door and let me languish here in the darkness of this upper room with my too small image of a puny God, a God I can mold and shape and worship without fear. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Faced with the vast, awe-inspiring darkness of the cosmos, it can be difficult to catch glimpses of tangible markers to guide us. Squinting into the abyss of unknowing, I can't help thinking about the women who stared into the darkness of the empty tomb. The darkness of the cosmos, like the darkness of the empty tomb, can send us racing back to the safety of a familiar room, a hideout, where we can shut the door and nurse our fears. Or the darkness can be for us a place where resurrection begins, as the birth pangs of a new way of being give way to new life. Peering beyond the wounds inflicted by our personifications of the one who is more than we can begin to imagine? Can we begin to touch and be touched by the love which is the source of everything? Can we begin to feel the power of divinity, which is so much more than our ridiculous personifications? Do we have the courage to put ourselves in the embrace of the Spirit, which pulses, evolves, moves, shakes, and brings into being all that is? Inspired by this Spirit, dare we begin to see divinity finding expression in the likes of Jesus? Might we see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus a way of being which is capable of transcending fear, so that we too might become love? For being love is what resurrection is. The love which is the mystery we call God is beyond our ability to imagine or to express, but that love lives in, with, through, and beyond us. Death cannot limit love. For no matter how many times this cruel world tries to destroy love, love will live again in, with, through, and beyond all of those who embody love. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Our too small personification of God is dead, sacrificed on the altars of reality. But do not be afraid. Death will not have the final word. Out of the darkness, love springs to life. Love lives even in us, even in our woundedness. Love lives in us, even though the wounds inflicted and acquired as we incomplete beings evolve into the love which we are created to be. Love, which is the source of all, lives and has being in, with, through, and beyond us. Blessed are you who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Believe the one who is our lover, beloved, and breath of love. Resurrection happens when we are that love in the world. Alas, all too often our ability to be love in the world is limited by our imaginations. Our inability to imagine or conceive of the divine mystery is all too often matched by our inability to imagine or conceive of humanity as anything other than fallen. Interpretations of the stories told by our ancestors have been picked over to highlight images of humans as creatures created by our all too small image of divinity. Images of original humans who arrived on earth as perfect beings only to fall from grace. Fall from grace is a technical term for what amounts to falling out of love. That is to say, to become separate from the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Humanity's banishment from paradise is the consequence of humanity's fall. So the theory goes. The evidence of reality, together with all that we have and continue to learn about the evolutionary nature of humanity, directly contradicts the literal interpretations of the stories told by our ancient ancestors. When evidence contradicts theology, it is theology and not reality which must change. Humans are ever evolving creatures. We have no perfect state from which to fall. Theories of atonement rely upon the doctrine of the fall, and therefore and you'll have to pardon the pun here, atonement theologies fall short of any serious reflection on the nature of reality as we know it today. Cognizant of the ever-evolving nature of humanity, we must set aside the constraints which previous interpreters of reality have placed upon our vision. These limits to our vision must be set aside. Looking around us now, it's difficult to reconcile the common Christianity of recent history's lack of imagination with the expansive dreams of the first 10 centuries of Christianity. It took Jesus 1,000 years to die. In their book, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, Brock and Parker insist that it took Jesus 1,000 years to die. Images of his corpse did not appear in churches until the 10th century. Imagine that if you can. Images of the corpse of Jesus, so think of all those crucifixes, don't appear in churches until the 10th century. Images of Jesus' suffering and death were absent from early churches. Sadly, the common Christianity of recent history seems fixated upon Jesus' suffering and death. Have we forgotten the words ascribed to the messengers outside of Jesus' empty tomb? Why do you look for the living among the dead? The living, breathing love, which is the divine mystery we call God, is not to be found in the tombs infested with dead interpretations of reality based upon rotting theologies. Historians tell us that early followers of Jesus' way of being in the world viewed reality through Jewish lenses. Christianity was birthed and grew for centuries, believing that paradise, or what we call heaven, was right here and right now, not in some distant, far-off afterlife, but here in this life. Paradise, what we call heaven, for most of Christian history, is that place permeated and blessed by the Spirit of God, what Jesus referred to as the Basileia ton theon, the realm of God, the realm of divinity, the realm of love. That whole notion of the kingdom of God falls so far short of capturing this notion of the realm of love. In early Christianity, heaven and hell were dimensions of this life. The role of the ecclesia, or the church herself, was to provide intense training to prepare the faithful to be initiated into paradise in this life. Through baptism, Christians learn to resist the forces of sin and evil and become wise about how good and evil work in the world, especially the oppressive powers of empires. Followers of Jesus' way of being in the world undertook spiritual disciplines together and looked to Jesus as the model of their own divinity and of their own agency in this life. As Savior, Jesus merely enabled their adoption into God's family, into the family of divinity. Jesus was looked to as the human embodiment of divinity, capable of transforming the world into paradise. To experience the divinity in all things was to become the embodiment of love in the world, the love which creates paradise. Living together in the garden of God, communities of Jesus followers struggle together to stay grounded in love, in justice, in nonviolence, in wisdom, and in freedom. Modern followers of Jesus' way of being in the world would do well to be inspired to build communities which share resources, cultivate wisdom and honesty, to understand ideas and doctrines, and to care for each other in sickness and in need. Easter's 50-day celebration of resurrection provides a wonderful opportunity to explore the book of Acts, written at the end of the first century, addressed to Dear Theophilus, which translates quite literally as Dear Lovers of God. The book of Acts is an edited picture of Christianity's first acts, before the shift to an obsession with atoning death and redemption through suffering and violence. Before Christianity replaced resurrection and life with crucifixion-centered salvation, and regulating paradise to some distant afterlife. In the book of Acts, where the anonymous gospel storyteller we call Luke attributes to the Apostle Paul words which refuse to constrict the imagination, as Paul implores people, the people of Athens to be specific, to see beyond the idols and images which have captured their devotion, to see beyond them toward the one in whom we live and move and have our being. The intimacy of such a one is the very love into which we are adopted as we become children of divinity, a divinity whose very nature is love, love more powerful than the word love can possibly convey. These early Christian images of reality are a far cry from the images upheld since about the 12th century, cited by some as the century in which love died. The details of crucifixion's ascension of sorts are many, not the least of which includes the tribalism fostered by the institutional church, which had the effect of banishing paradise from the earth and restricting access to salvation to the imperial whims of an ever-increasing hierarchy designed to keep the faithful from rising. Thoughts and images of resurrection and paradise were offloaded to some future life, while hells beyond measure darkened this world. Amplified by wars, plagues, and death, suffering ushered in not the basileia temps féant, not the realm of love, but the dark ages. Suffering restricted the imaginations of the faithful, utilizing, some might say, weaponizing the church's emphasis upon suffering to inculcate the faithful to lives spent in obedience, which gave birth to the acquiescence of a too small God, out there or up there, sitting in judgment, ready to punish and hungry for blood, a too small God whose superpower is to stunt the evolution of humanity. That centuries of calamities responsible for the deaths of half of Europe's population, some 20 million people died horrendous deaths, that this should foster a dismal Christianity obsessed with suffering ought not to surprise us. That we have allowed suffering to stunt our evolution rather than propel our evolution is the kind of bondage to sin from which we must free ourselves. As 21st century earth dwellers, we are blessed beyond the dreams of our ancestors. Many of us have been living in the land of milk and honey for so long that we have forgotten the sufferings of all those who have gone before us, even as we have evolved in ways which make it possible for us to ignore the suffering of our neighbors. Perhaps the groaning of the earth herself will grow loud enough to capture our attention long enough for us to remind one another that we are already one, and when one part of us suffers, we all suffer. The evidence of suffering is there for us all to see. Our technology makes it impossible not to confess that we are both the perpetrators of suffering as well as ones who suffer. If suffering is evolution's goal, then surely we have scored. Fortunately, our ancestors provided a broader vision of love's encounter with suffering. In the words attributed to Jesus, we hear, "I have come that you might have life and live it abundantly." Abundant life cannot be built upon suffering. It is long past time for us to wake up, to stand up, to rise up, to pay attention to the suffering of creation and her creatures. As those who seek to follow Jesus' way of being in the world, we are called not to champion suffering, not to usher in more dark ages, but to usher in the Basileia Tonfeon, the realm of love. We are called to do this by being champions of abundant life for all. We are not fallen creatures. This knowledge has to change the way in which we see our relationship with the mystery that lies at the very source of our being, our Creator, if you will. This knowledge has an impact on how we interpret the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. If we look at the stories which the common Christianity of recent history tells us about Jesus, stories which have contributed so much to the creation of the idol that masquerades as the mystery we call God, we discover a narrative which seems preoccupied with Jesus' death. Imagine, just for a moment, the life of Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, and then simply focus upon their death. Imagine trying to understand who Dr. King was and focusing your attention upon his assassination. Imagine knowing everything there is to know about the final day in Memphis, about the motel, about the people who were on that balcony when Dr. King was shot, about the shooter, the gun that was used, about the funeral procession, the grieving, and about the people who tried to go walking in the ways of Dr. King. Imagine all the information you would miss if you simply focused upon Dr. King's death. You wouldn't know very much about the civil rights movement, about Dr. King's dream, his vision of equality, his struggle for inclusion, his cries for justice for the poor, his economic vision of equality, or his passion for peace and his commitment to nonviolent resistance. When we focus upon the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, rather than the suffering and death of Jesus, we can begin to hear some of the things which Jesus was passionate about. Jesus' passions reveal to us the image of the mystery that we call God, which Jesus worshiped. When we set aside the institutional narrative of atonement, which the Church has relied upon to interpret the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the idol that masquerades as God, the idol whose contours are reinforced by our worship services, by our hymns, by our prayers, our creeds, the choice of scripture readings, our rituals, and the idol will begin to crumble. When we forgo our obsession with Jesus' death, which is reinforced by what we do when we gather together, when we forgo our obsession with Jesus' death and open ourselves to the passions of Jesus' life, we begin to see new ways to understand the new images of the Holy One, which Jesus encouraged his followers to see. Jesus' life reveals images of God which point far beyond the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to the ultimate mystery that lies at the very heart of all reality. The Apostle Paul, who was the first to write about Jesus, portrays Jesus as a doorway into the ultimate. For Paul, Jesus was not God, but a human in which God is revealed. For us, Jesus can be the medium through which the mystery we call God can be imagined. For centuries, our imaginations have been limited by images created in darkness, when the institutional church carefully crafted creeds about the nature of God and interpreted the death of Jesus in ways which reflected their limited knowledge of reality. Our ever-expanding knowledge of reality is inconsistent with these Dark Ages interpretations of the experience of Jesus. Setting aside the doctrines of previous centuries frees us to explore Jesus' life from a whole new perspective, a perspective which embraces all that we have learned about what it means to be human, a perspective which is mindful of the vast expanse of the cosmos, a perspective which sheds light on the evolution of our species, a perspective which provides a window on the process of healing the wounds created not by our bondage to sin, but rather by our incompleteness, a perspective which points beyond itself to a oneness with the mystery, which is the love that we call God. Take, for example, Jesus' passion for nonviolent resistance to oppression. In a world where tribalism was the only remedy offered as a solution to our quest for survival, our evolutionary desire to survive at all costs, and all that we are offered to quench our desire is tribalism. We will survive if our tribe survives. The life of Jesus represents a significant evolution in human consciousness. Jesus was able to move beyond this tribalism. Jesus was able to evolve beyond the human instinct for survival and give himself to and for others. When we tell the story of Jesus' life from this perspective, we, like the early followers of Jesus, are able to see the love that is God lived out in the life of a human being. In Jesus, God did not invade the world, coming down from heaven to pay a price for human sinfulness. In Jesus, we see a life in which the divine is revealed. Jesus broke down the boundaries and the barriers by which humans separated themselves from one another. The love that is God, which is seen in Jesus, was the overcoming of all fear and division. In the presence and through the experience of Jesus' life, the tribal barriers between Jew and Gentile, Jew and Samaritan, male and female, Jew and Roman, bound and free, rich and poor, life and death, all these divisions fade away. In the life of Jesus, there is a humanity which included all and that dismissed no one. In the life of Jesus, a human community without boundaries could be imagined. In the life of Jesus, God is imagined as the power of life, the passion of love, the ground of being, which draws all lives into a new way of being human. In Jesus, we see the love that is God lived out in the life of a human being. In Jesus' life, we are able to see a way of being that moves us beyond our tribal instincts, beyond our fear, beyond our obsession with our own survival, and points us toward a way of being that is open to the power of the reality, which is the love that is God. In the life of Jesus, the passions of Jesus, we are directed beyond the idol we worship as God, beyond the doctrines created by misrememberings and misunderstandings of reality, beyond the primitive madness of a blood sacrifice for sin, beyond the fear of a judgmental God, toward an integration of all that we are learning about what it means to be human in a cosmos far more incredible than our ancestors could ever begin to imagine. The passions of Jesus are embodied in a life that reveals the love that is God. As followers of Jesus' way of being in the world, we are called to embody that love here and now in ways which will continue to move us beyond our tribal quest for survival, beyond our fear of death, beyond the divisions which threaten not only human life, but all life. As followers of Jesus' way of being in the world, we are called to evolve in ways that will expand human consciousness so that all may know the love that is God. These are the gifts of abundant life. Like the sun up in the sky, Jesus hasn't changed. What is changing is the way in which we are seeing Jesus, the way in which we are telling Jesus' story. The experience of Jesus remains the same. The explanations of that experience are changing. As we evolve, as our consciousness expands, so too do our understandings of what it means to be human. The life of Jesus continues to point beyond the craven idols we create to worship, beyond our deepest fear, beyond our tribal urges, beyond our limited vision, beyond the beyond, and beyond that also to the one who is our lover, beloved, and breath of love. Yes, Herr Nietzsche, God is dead, and it is we, you and I, who have killed him. As for the madman's question, what are these churches now if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God? These tombs are empty. We cannot seek the living among the dead. Let the church be resurrected, born anew, transformed into communities in which love is born again and again and again. Now, I dumped a lot of your questions into that response, and mostly because there were familiar threads running through your questions, threads that indicated a desire to hold on to particular personifications of the mystery because it's easier that way. And I think one of the most liberating things about all of what we are learning about what it means to be human, about our place in the cosmos, and what we're learning about the history that has remained hidden to us for so very long, all of that is not to be feared. These are exciting times. The divinity that we have carved into some sort of idol has escaped our idol, and we are freed to be in relationship with that mystery, which is love. I suspect that Jesus' very purpose in our lives is to become almost obsolete. Now, by that, I mean that if we look at the role and function of Jesus in the early church, in the church right up until the Dark Ages, if we look at the stories told about Jesus, it's all about liberation. And so I think that one of the things that happens with liberators is they are not liberating you so that they can enslave you, but they're liberating you so that you can go on to liberate others. And so if you like, Jesus' role and function is to become obsolete as a medium and never to become the object of worship. That is idolatry. Okay, I've been droning on for a long time. Responses. If you have a question that you don't think was addressed in this, hold on to it for a little bit, and we'll get to it in a little bit. But any responses to what you've just heard?
Susan. I just want to say thank you for this. I feel like this sort of breath of fresh air and for everything that you've said. This particular synopsis of just kind of allowing us to, first of all, abide the mystery as opposed to what's the certainty. Isn't that what faith is? And for me, it's like, my spiritual life is all about mystery, and my understanding of Jesus and relationship with Jesus is all about the mystery. So, and I just really love sort of thinking about Jesus as liberating. So my spiritual director and I have been wrangling with this, or he's been wrangling with me as I wrangle with it. And he talked about Jesus coming to initiate people. into the ground of love, which is kind of a similar
Mhm.
idea. So I just feel very refreshed by what you've shared. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. To follow up on what you're saying there, one of these ideas of initiation, if you read what it was that was being taught to the early followers before they were baptized, um, a lot of that's becoming clearer with the work of various New Testament and early church history scholars. And one of the things that they're discovering is that the things that they were being initiated in are not things that, certainly not any baptismal preparation book that I've ever read from the 20th or 21st century. They were being initiated in how to effect transformation in people's lives, not to believe in Jesus or to believe in God or to believe in the Holy Spirit or the Sacred Trinity or the Virgin Mary or even the story of Jesus, but rather to be transformed by an encounter with this story about love, love so overwhelming that one is prepared to seek justice, and to provide for the loved. And I think that piece, I still love the words of Brian McLaren on this, and that is that what would happen if churches stopped worrying about inculcating the faith and became places where people could be transformed for life in the world, transformed for the work of love in the world. That to me seems more consistent with the teachings of Jesus. And it sets us apart from the status quo. One of the big problems for those of us in the West, particularly in Canada and the United States, is that we are living in various different empires. And those empires are exacting a cost from the earth and from the earth's creatures. And that makes us both perpetrators of abuse and victims of abuse. It's like this whole systemic involvement means that we have to stop doing what Christianity has done for centuries now, and that is externalizing evil. So, in terms of human evolution, recognizing the reality of who we are as incomplete creatures, ever evolving creatures, provides a place from which we can tackle the difficult issues of the evil that dwells within us, that is a part of this incompleteness. A couple of your questions were around explaining, evil in the world. And as people who dwell in the world, we all too often are willing to externalize evil. We have to recognize evil as a consequence of this incompleteness that we are living. Anyone else? So what do we do with this? I remember telling myself that I would have to learn very carefully this evening to sit in the silence of unknowing. Andrew.
I found myself reminded of the profound sense of being unconditionally loved, overwhelmingly unconditionally loved. And therefore, what is possible? What does that change in me? What can I do if I know that? What am I afraid of anymore? if I know that, and not just a head know, just somehow my whole being knowing that. And then I'm liberated to actually look at the ugliness in me, actually to look at the good in me. It's just, and almost impossible to judge anybody else. There's just the sense that they too are unconditionally loved, but they don't know it. And anyway, so that was where it took me.
The other day, someone sent me a clip. I think it was Ilya Delio from the Work of the People videos, and she was talking about the freedom of knowing who we are, and being able to look into the mirror and recognize ourselves as loved, and how we embody that in the world. And for a long time, I've been working to try and figure out, how do we reflect that when we're together, and how do we make the walls between what we feel in that love and the people who feel that they're beyond that love. So how do we open ourselves, how do we make our own walls more permeable? And it seems to me that this thing that we call worship, this gathering together, the technical explanation for worship goes along the lines of, just from a linguistic point of view, ascribing worth to something. My own definition that I'm still trying to reduce down to something a little bit more tangible is gathering together to open ourselves to the more. Right? We gather together in community to open ourselves to the more, so that, nourished and grounded in that knowledge that we are part of one that is greater than us, of a love beyond our comprehension, that nourishment then propels us into the world to be lovers, right? And so how do we take this knowledge and embody it in our everyday lives, in our worship lives, in the way we talk to one another, in the way we listen to one another? How do we do that? And it seems to me that we have, in worship, have ascribed worth to the institution and to many of the idols which don't disturb us as much as the ultimate reality does. And that's, in some ways, that's okay, as long as it doesn't stop there, right? So, for example, veneration of the saints, no problem, if that helps us open us up to the world. But if that becomes your entire worship life or spiritual life or practice, then it's divorced from the reality in which we live in the here and now. And so the question becomes, where's the balance in community? How do we call each other to account on that? One of the things that came through in the questions was this notion that, I'm trying to say this without identifying people, because I don't think that's fair. So there was this sense, even in the question, that it was the elsewhere God that was being queried. The reluctance to let go of the personification of the deity, and try to speak in terms that opened up our field of vision rather than restricted it. And I struggle with that all the time, especially when we're trying to talk to people out in the world about what it is we find compelling about life in the faith. Mary
Well,
Teresa.
you know, I came to this tonight after watching the news,
Mm,
and it's just so overwhelmingly awful. You know, so when you say, oh, what can we do, you know, in order to embody all of this, you know, and to make a difference. And I'll tell you, I was starting to want to look for real estate somewhere else in the world, you know, just because it just seems every day there's just more violence and and I don't know how my love in the world is right now making it any impact at all. You know, maybe within my little community, and people know that I love them and care for them. But where does it impact beyond? You know, I sometimes I just feel at such a loss.
hmm Well, I think that kind of almost frustration, but it's deeper than frustration, that we all feel that we can't effect the changes that are necessary. Because we're all of us on this screen here are all powerful and all wise, and we know just what needs doing in order to make the world paradise, right? This notion of what is abundant life. Um, I think that one of the things that we have not done well in our gatherings for worship, and I'm limiting it to worship now because that's a place where the conversation can start, because we all have worship in common, I think. And so we have not done a good enough job of seeing worship as more than a limited timepiece in our week, right? So we've reduced worship. So living in community, we have reduced that for the most part to Sunday morning and maybe one other time during the week, right? And that belittles the tremendous angst that we feel for the situation you're describing in the world, right? We ought to be getting together almost every day to talk about what it is we can do together to make a difference. So your question should be our daily questions, but we also need to be getting together every day to say, well done, Mary Therese. You did a splendid job yesterday telling someone that you love them and you've made a real difference in their lives. Well done. Or help me, I'm struggling with this. uh, it doesn't seem clear what's the most what's the route to peace in this situation. And I think that for a large part of our um, existence as worship communities or as church, and I'm more and more like not wanting to use that word church anymore. um, Fellow followers of the way, when we get together, um, it seems to me that we haven't done a good enough job of nourishing one another so that our worship together can be multifaceted, right? So that it can be celebratory, it can be nourishing, it can be a lament for the situation in the world. Um, we just haven't given people the tools to do that in community. And we've offered limited options for people. Someone was saying the other day that they were really upset because they were touring, I think it was in London somewhere, and they came upon a locked church. And so they took that as a sign from the church that the church didn't care. And I said, I responded to them by saying, well, could it be that we don't care about the church? And so it had to lock its doors. Like, did you knock on the door and ask, is this community all right? Are you guys okay? Your door's locked. Are you afraid of something? Can I help? Like, it seems to me that we don't even take seriously the communities of which we are a part, whether they're simply worshiping communities, house churches, gatherings of the faithful. We haven't really taken seriously this call to be in community. Uh, Now, we've just come out of a huge shared experience in terms of the pandemic, and the contours of community have in some ways expanded and in some ways contracted. More and more institutional churches are closing. They're closing at a phenomenal rate. Communities that are existing online are thriving, but they're thriving in ways that we find difficult to measure because our instruments of measurement are geared towards the institutional church. But if we're still gathering together, even if we are doing it in a new way and still presenting an old narrative that no longer speaks to our reality, then what's the point of that? So how then are we going to speak to our current reality? I happen to think that story is a fabulous medium through which to change the world, and to change it usually one person at a time. And I think that the stories that have been handed down to us are particularly powerful. It's the misrememberings of so many of those stories, and some of the stories are useless. Like, we need to just what was the president you had who cut all the bits of the Bible out that they didn't like? You had was it one of your presidents, I think? Jefferson, the Jefferson Bible. That's right. You just cut out the pieces that you didn't like. Well, Martin Luther did something similar, right? He didn't like the James or Revelation. He wanted them both expunged from the Bible. And there are some stories that we should just take out. But this preoccupation with the details aren't going to get us there. We're not going to transform people's lives arguing over the details of Jesus' life or of theologies, or the big questions that people have are about the nature of reality. And if Jesus can't speak to the nature of our reality, then let's celebrate Jesus as someone who existed in the past but has nothing to say to us in the here and now, and move on. I'm not ready to give that up yet. So, is there anyone who, in the last little bit here, is there anyone who has a question that wasn't addressed, whether or not you had a chance to send it to me or not?
I just
Jackie.
had a thought. Oh, sorry.
Who's next?
Well, Katie and then Jackie.
Okay.
I didn't have a question per se, but just in response to what you just said, our young generations have done exactly what you just said. And can you say it one more time? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Say,
Just sort of walked away from everything.
walked away from everything. And so my response to that is, many of the people I talk to on a one-to-one basis who have walked away from Christianity or walked away from the church have walked away from an understanding of Christianity that is probably at about a grade 5 level.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I first came into the church. So I came into the church as a teenager of about 15. And I came because I saw people caring for one another in a way that I'd never seen before. And it challenged my assumptions about what Christianity was. And so what I see more and more in people is that they've rejected the narrative that was told to them at about a grade 5 level. And I'm with them. I reject that grade 5 level narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's time to put away childish things. And that Jesus died to save us from our sins, and that God is a bloodthirsty executioner, I had got no time for that. But that's what they've rejected.
Mhm.
And it may be too late to go back and say, no, that's not what we're about here. And if that's true, then we have to find new ways of embodying the love, which is at the heart of reality. Because the world is in such turmoil. And I know every generation thinks, the problems are worse in their generation, but things are speeding up in terms of care, the crisis in terms of the environment, our ability to annihilate ourselves, escalating talk of war, violence, the lack of compassion in much of our empire, particularly our commercial empires. That lack of compassion is calling for a new way of being in the world. And I think that we haven't really ever tried Christianity. And so this kind of radical form of Christianity, I'm currently reading that, what is it? Mary Magdalene Revealed, another book that you might want to read. I can't remember the author. I've got it here somewhere. Mary Magdalene Revealed. And the thesis of that particular book is, and it's based on the Gospel of Mary, is that we've never actually tried Christianity.
Mhm.
We've never tried it. Now, there are some who would point to the book of Acts and say, well, yeah, we tried it right there. There it is. But I don't know. I'm not sure we've ever tried it.
I just wanted to expand on that, just super brief here, and give Mary Teresa some hope too. My husband and I both teach high school, and we've taught for about 20 years now together. And I have seen a really, really awesome transition of young people from when I first started to where I'm at right now. And I just notice it like every day, and it is particularly in males, young males, that are very, very emotional and affectionate, and would look nothing like the traditional males of like when I was back in high school in the 90s. And I just think that this younger generation is embodying what we need, and they just don't know how to articulate and express it yet. But I think our language of all this really abstract stuff is exactly the language that they'll express that through, but they just don't know how to speak it yet. But they're bringing in, I think, what we need.
And so the challenge for those of us who are a little longer in the tooth, looking around the screen, there are a few of you who are probably younger than I am, but most of you are as old or maybe a little older than I am. We are the elders. And so one of the things that I think falls to us as keepers of these particular stories is finding ways to share the wisdom that we've gleaned. Because I think that something happened in the last few generations. And there's some people who point to the First World War, and others who would argue that it was not until the Holocaust, and that is that something happened in the generations, and the respect for elders in the community, because elders used to be trained in how to impart wisdom, and nobody trained us, I don't think. Were you, any of you, trained on how to impart wisdom? That wasn't part. I mean, even in seminary, they weren't much concerned with that. They were just concerned that I could recite that big pile of theology the same way they taught it to me. That's all they were concerned about. Wisdom was not an issue. How do those of us who are elders accompany younger generations in in this desire to embody love. And for me, if someone starts a church down the road saying, you know, we want to accompany one another in this desire to be love in the world, I'm in, sign me up. And I think that's what young people are doing in many ways. But there's a whole lost generation out there who don't know these stories. And so how do we impart this wisdom? And it's not just the Jesus story. The Jesus story is almost not as compelling to a lot of people outside of the church as the mystery piece. That's, you know, when you hear this phrase, much used, maligned phrase of spiritual but not religious, I think that what people are getting at is the trappings of religion are getting in the way of mystery. And how do we, the elders who have experienced this profound love, how do we accompany younger people in a way that imparts wisdom and is open to receiving new insights? So here's a question I have for you, and mostly it's a question that is inspired by your questions, and that is, several people ask questions about life after death, and the purpose of Christianity, right? Which I think are at odds with one another, right? Because I don't think Christianity has anything to do with life after death. I think Christianity has to do with being alive in the here and now, right? Of love being born again and again and again, over and over and over, wherever it is needed. And yet, for many people, the questions around the end of life say more to me about the questioner than about Christianity itself, right? That's not the goal. I think what we're talking about here is a real fear that this is all there is, right? So, whereas Christianity, if you read it, and in fact Judaism and Islam, and to a certain extent Buddhism, although I'm not as qualified to speak about Buddhism as Islam, but certainly has this drive to be present in each and every moment of this life, to be awake to what's going on around us in the lives of our fellow human beings and fellow creatures, and indeed of the earth herself. And yet, so much of Western questions about mystery are anchored in our fear of death. And so, how do we, as elders, communicate to one another and to those of other communities an appreciation of life in the here and now, and of the sanctity of life in the here and now? Because it seems to me that that's the only way, until every person is seen as sacred and every life is seen as sacred, we will continue down the path of violence. And so how do we move people away from their own fear of death, this own I mean, because if you look at the story of Jesus, what you have there is if Jesus was afraid of death, he would have never have gone to Jerusalem. If his relationship with the mystery was predicated on his fear of death, the story would not have unfolded the way it did. What triumphed in the story of Jesus is his love for those in need, for the poor and for those in need. And his love for them was more important to him than his fear of death. And how do we create spaces to nurture that in ourselves, in one another, and in our neighbor? That we can afford to take risks in this life because this life is sacred, and not be motivated by our fear of death. And indeed, to have realistic conversations about our fear of death. Because in the deep, dark places of the night, I think the fear is there, the fear of the unknown. And so how do we be honest with one another about that? Or if we figured out a way to overcome that, how do we share it? I haven't figured out how to overcome it yet. So, I mean, I have moments where it doesn't consume me, but when it's dark, it's dark. Anyone?
Bridget.
Well, I'm not sure. And one of the things I got from the book that you mentioned at the beginning of our time together tonight, After Jesus, Before Christianity, one thing I really got from that book was that in those early communities, they tried to live out what they had been taught. So for instance, women were leaders in those communities, even though they weren't allowed to be leaders in the rest of society, or slaves were valued the same as the rich people in those communities, and so on. So there was almost a practicing or a living out of what they had learned. And it occurs to me that the kind of community that I would like to be part of, or would like to, I'm craving, is a place where one can sort of practice those things. So a kind of a place to try out those things and to bring, as Mary Teresa said, your sorrow and your feelings of helplessness, and get supported. But the other thing I think that occurs to me as we were talking about as Katie was talking about the younger generation, is that we have a lot to learn from them. And so we wonder how we can tell the story, but until we go back to thinking about what are the questions and the concerns and the middle of the night fears of people today, how will we know how to tell Jesus' story in current terms? I don't know if that came out right, but I look at my daughter, who's not as young as the young people you're talking about, Katie, but she and her wife are in their 30s, and they have a different set of values in terms of valuing relationships over employment records, and all sorts of things. But then their concerns are, will the world still be around for my children? And I mean, until we know, I think that's where the wisdom comes back to us. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
So
there's a wisdom and change of perspective in really listening to younger people.
I agree with you, Jackie, but I think that the pendulum might have swung too far. I think
Well,
that
we won't necessarily hear them inside the
Yeah.
church, but I hear them here in my home, and Katie hears them in her high school, and we hear them in the community. And then we have to be able to practice. How do we do that listening, and how do we then share the wisdom we might feel we have in a way that's accessible to them?
and
I'm not saying
sometimes
they're going to come into the church to be interviewed, because it's
Yeah.
going to happen.
forget the church for now. Just forget the church. Let's just talk about relating to one another as human beings. I think one of the things that's happened, and by your tone and your deference, I get it, right? We want to be respectful of others. We want to listen. But I think in some ways the pendulum has swung the other way. And those things that we hold dear, those values that we hold dear, aren't often expressed by us out of deference, out of this desire to listen. I was talking with a clergy colleague a while back now, and he was talking about, see how I can express this. Yeah, I'm just going to do it, because what I'm talking about is the fear of causing offense.
Mm.
We have created an inoffensive religion because of the sins of the past, because of the horrible narrative of this bloodthirsty, vengeful God. We really don't want to offend anyone with our wisdom, and so we're not expressing it, right? You know that old adage that if you don't ever have conversations about politics and religion, then you'll have idiots for politicians and your religion will be trite, right? Because you've never really wrestled with either of those issues as people, because you're afraid of causing offense. And I think one of the things that we've forgotten how to do is how to argue with one another, how to disagree with one another, how to say to young people, well, like, that's not going to work. Or, yeah, that might work, but what about this? Like, to actually express something, there's this fear of causing offense. And I'm not suggesting that it's always that way, but I think when it's something that we really hold dear, that's really precious to us, we've forgotten to share what is precious to us.
Mhm.
Like, the wisdom that sustains us in this life is a precious gift. And it's hard-won wisdom. We've all been through it, right? We've all struggled. And if we're not willing to share that with others for fear of causing offense, well, then the pendulum has swung too far. Like, we do have to listen and we do have to learn from others, but there comes a time when we have to have the courage to speak ourselves. Bridget.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. The fear in the middle of the night. I think I start by sharing my own story of being loved and where that love has taken me, and why I feel that in that it's great mystery that I'm just immersed and embraced. So whatever this transition is going to be, it's going to be in love and in trust and being held. I know that it's not just a head trip that, it's all this theology and all. It's a lifelong path of faith and struggle and day-to-day attempts and failures to love. And the greatest, most wonderful thing about my life is I have been so loved, and I have such an experience of love that is beyond imagination. I have that. And so if you say, share your deepest wisdom, that's there. And everyone has it. It's like, oh my gosh, the consciousness, can we, and I've experienced it in community with people just praying together. It's like, oh my God, just being together and open. sometimes the wisdom and the love and the strength and the courage, the tears, the hurt, the pain, the woundedness, all of that's there, but greater still. And that's how I feel the love that is at the center of everything. The oneness we share is beyond anything we can even begin to understand or verbalize about. It's beyond, I love beyond the beyond, because everything is that, but it's all about, that's all that Jesus and every single great spiritual leader and all the dear ones who suffer right around us, that's the love. They are in that love, but sometimes folks are not conscious of their deepest reality, that love is there right in the middle of the crapola.
And also, not to be Pollyannish about love. It's hard work, and being in community is hard work. And I think that sometimes we have forgotten the demanding contours of love, and how difficult that can be, and how can we possibly support one another in the work of love if we're not prepared to be realistic about the dangers of love. So it's an all-encompassing desire to live life fully, which to me is the definition of abundant life, right? To be fully present to the here and now, and to those that are around us. Suzanne, you're next.
Well, I just wondered if you were going to give us any more challenges. It's really, overwhelming. And I think it's a matter, I guess, for me anyway, of baby steps into how to introduce or begin to, introduce this to, whether it's our women priests or whether it's our, family or whatever it is. So I really thank you for it. I think it's something that we all need to hear and listen to. It reminds me a little bit, I just finished earlier this morning, this book, Women, Earth and Creator Spirit by Elizabeth Johnson. It was written in 1993, which is kind of interesting because she's really bringing up about the blue planet and the ecology and all of that. But if you want just a quick little book, I just think this is a great follow-up for what you've been talking about.
Thanks. Anything Elizabeth Johnson writes is worth reading.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The other thing is I stuck in the chat a documentary about the Jesus female disciples from Helen Bond and Joan Taylor that just came out last week from Future Church. It's a 47-minute documentary about the women that really were there and some of the new evidence and finds that, at least I had never heard these two before. Maybe you're familiar with them, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I hated to bring that up right now, but I didn't want to forget it because it's really hard to follow up on you, Bridget Mary, when you start talking about love and all the real spiritual side about all this. So I kind of changed it a little bit, but I really think what you had to say was right on, and really the crux of what you've been mentioning for the last, I don't know how many sessions we've had here. But it's certainly a challenge because trying to go from where we've been with this religion that we've been taught and switching to this gears, I don't know. It seems like we've got to take some baby steps with a lot of people, or they're going to think we've gone really off the deep end, for lack of a better way to say it, unless you're in a very progressive community or progressive group.
So you're never going to be in a very progressive community and a very progressive group unless you create one.
Right. Well, that.
And to be honest with you, when I was talking to Bridget Mary about the difficult contours of love, I suspect that Jesus of Nazareth would be a very difficult person to have around because he didn't like baby steps.
Right.
He was offensive. He shouted at people. He got his message across. And I confess here and now that there have been times when I have taken the easy road and done those baby steps. I'm encouraging, we don't have time for baby steps.
Well, that's something she points out in this book. There's no more time left
Yeah.
in the planet. Um,
But it's not just the planet. I think people are so desperate and so hungry for something more, to be related to that which is beyond what we experience. And I think that, well, what do I know? I think that you need to be courageous, and I think you need to take big, giant steps, because there really isn't time. As long as there exists on this planet the kind of fundamentalism that is destroying so many lives and threatens our very existence, then we have to take some pretty bold steps. And that's the hard contour of love, because that we will be rejected for that. But the number of times people have expressed gratitude for this new way of understanding the mystery, or trying to relate to mystery, or being able to sit in the silence of unknowing, I think it's worth taking risks when it comes to offending people. Andrew, and then Denise.
I'm thinking that if we lived forever, we could procrastinate forever, but we don't. So we've got this gift of death coming up on all of us, and it's time for us to perceive it and act, because it's a lie that we have got unlimited time. It's now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially if we want to give birth to paradise here.
Yeah.
Denise, you're muted, sweetie.
It's a little bit like Andrew, but not. Could you say a few words about the starkness of sorrow? Because it has to do so very often with death. And when you're out there and you just realize how deeply it affects you. It's not that I'm afraid of death, but death itself affects us deeply. I'm almost ready to think that love and sorrow bind us as human beings the most closely, but I don't know how to overcome that. And it's so stark in my face, in my soul. And I love the expanse of God. Can't handle what's happening, or with great difficulty. So what does a progressive minister say to me?
First of all, I say thank you, because what I was talking about when I was talking about having conversations that are real, the sorrow that you are expressing is that reality. I personally believe that sorrow, and I'm still working on this in my head and wrestling with it. I think sorrow is an aspect of love. It's not something other than love. Sorrow is an expression of love. And one of the things that we need we need to learn, I need to learn, okay, I'm going to speak personally here. I need to learn is to be in the presence of sorrow. Now it's mitigated slightly because we're on a screen here, but every person on this screen, our hearts are going out to you in your sorrow. That's the only kind of atonement, the only kind of at-one-ment that I know how to experience. And that is the compassion that you are inspiring here and now in this space. And I don't want to minimize death in any way, shape, or form, because, well, it's writ large. It's writ large for me tonight. My mom is probably going to die in the next 24 hours or so. And so death is very much on my mind, and sorrow and joy and wanting her to pass rather than not, because her life has no quality. So I don't want to minimize the pain of death and the pain which death creates. But when Andrew talked about the gift of death, there are aspects of death which I can receive as pure gift, and there are aspects of death which just take me to the depths, and I want to give it back. I don't ever want to have to deal with it again. But I do believe that there has to be a way for us to express our sorrow, because that sorrow is an aspect of the love in which we live and move and have our being. And that the most powerful words that we can hear sometimes is that Jesus wept. When we say that God is present in our sorrow, this is what it is, right? It's the God you see in the people on this screen. That's the presence of the mystery in our lives. And yet it's more than that, right? It's beyond that as well. But we need these tangible touchstones, these glimpses of the divine that we can see in one another. And having the courage to express your sorrow is an act of love in this space. And one of the things that I've yet to learn how to do is not to want to make it all better, right? Experiencing someone else's sorrow is painful, and oftentimes we just want to shut it down.
Okay, I find this on the web for experiencing someone else.
Siri just started talking over there. Sorry about that. I lost my train of thought. So yeah, shutting down one's sorrow instead of sitting in it and allowing myself to lament with you. I see Susan wants to get in on this conversation. Come on in.
I just wanted to say quickly, I also put some resources in the chat of some books that I found really helpful in my training in end of life care for how to live more fully with the awareness of death. And I also want to say that I think as elders, one of the best things that we can do to sort of bring this love into the world with younger people is to talk about death and to talk about sorrow and how we have grieved, because when you get to a certain age, we've all experienced it in some way. And I think that heart opening experience of, being able to be vulnerable with what you've experienced and simply witnessing, simply being a loving presence to somebody who is expressing grief. And thank you, Denise, for sharing yours. It was very touching. So I think that's just what I wanted to say, that I think that that's one of the best things that we can do.
Okay, so let me try something here, Denise. And I've known you for a while now, so it gives me the courage to try this. I want to be brutally honest. Your expression of your sorrow is deeply disturbing, and that's okay. I think so much of our sorrow goes unexpressed because we don't want to disturb other people with it. And so I think that one of the things that we've lost as our lives have become more individualized and we've forgotten about community, one of the things we've lost is the ability to maintain relationships that are disturbing. I had someone a while back say, I don't know, I can't go into groups anymore because people know what's happened to me and it just brings the whole group down. And so I just stay at home. And one of the things about the love in which we live and move and have our being is that for some weird reason, the experience of that almost demands the practice of it, right? And so we have to practice being disturbed by one another, sharing our grief and our sorrow and our fear in some really real and tangible ways. And for a long time, the experience of church was to dampen down, to explain away, to make you feel better, so that you're not afraid of death, so that you're not worried. Like, it's particularly when death has been horrendous, like tragic, awful. That's no gift to anyone, really, in many ways. And so our sorrow in response to that is an aspect of this love, which is complicated and difficult and challenging. And it's almost like, Andrew, you're better at wine metaphors than I am, but you have a really, wine that has little depth. And sure, it'll quench your thirst, it'll give you a little buzz, and that's fine. But when you drink a wine that has depth, it brings you into another place if you're truly present to the experience. And I think that's the purpose of worship for me, is to drink the wine of real depth and quality and body. Sorrow, grief, joy, frustration, anger, all of the wonderful aspects of love. That's nourishment, and empowers you to go beyond the community, to be an expression of love beyond the community. But I think it requires community. Thank you, Denise. I'm just looking at the time, and we have gone over. I almost don't want to sign off. It's been lovely to spend these weeks with you. I've appreciated the conversation, your willingness to share your wisdom, your sorrow, your insights. It has been a gift to me, and so I thank you for that. My challenge to you, Suzanne, and to the rest of the group is to keep up the good work of finding ways to express, to embody the love which is divinity, the love in which you are held tenderly, the love which you are always in the embrace of. And may you feel that love always. May you know that love in all its beauty, in all its terror, in all its magnificence, in all its challenges. May you know that you are held in the love which is beyond the beyond, and beyond that also, our lover, beloved, and breath of love. Amen.